Are you facing burnout? Have you experienced bullying in the workplace? Would you like your workplace to be terrific and not toxic? Hi, I'm Matt Hugg with Nonprofit.Courses with this Nonprofit Career Network event brought to you by Great Careers. And today, Mira Weinstein of Organizing to Win is going to talk about all those things and more. It's a really great presentation that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Let's get started. Hello, and this is Matt Hugg, and we are here with Great Careers and the Nonprofit Career Network. And today we have Mira Weinstein. And Mira comes to us from California. Thank you very much for working with the time difference here, Mira. And Mira is the owner of a company called Organizing to Win, which I'll let you explain what Organizing to Win does and give a little bit of background on yourself. So Mira, please.
So thanks for the intro. My name's Mira Weinstein, and Organizing to Win is organizing and political strategy consultancy. I work with social justice organizations, nonprofit organizations, and candidates to build power in progressive communities.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And today's topic, we're going to be talking about bullying and burnout and items that way. And but as you said, we talked a little earlier. You're not a therapist, a lawyer, an accountant, and all those good things. So what's your perspective on this?
Well, I come into this from learning the hard way. My whole background is in organizing campaigns and nonprofit organizations and political campaigns. So I learned this the hard way. And so I kind of developed a couple of ideas or thoughts about how to recognize unhealthy situations and how to cope with it. Yeah. And so I'm by no means an expert in this kind of thing. And like you said, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a therapist. I'm not an HR expert. So what I know about it comes from personal experience. It doesn't come from certifications or technical degrees or anything. I want to just make sure that I'm happy to share what I've learned about it and kind of how I've developed my own sense of a healthy workplace.
Right. Well, that's great. Well, this is, there really isn't anything that beats experience in a lot of these issues, especially if it's, unfortunately, in some of these issues, your own experience, and you kind of develop your own expertise informally. So thank you very much for being willing to share this. That almost makes it more meaningful because it comes directly from where you are on things. It's not a little less intellectual discussion, a little more practical. Right. But the other thing I wanted to bring out is that you talked about nonprofits but not necessarily 501c3 nonprofits. And this is important, I think, for our audience to grab onto, because we all think of nonprofits as, the Cancer Society or Little League baseball team, or maybe your local hospital or university or something. But there's a whole different aspect of nonprofits that aren't necessarily charities, that they're organized for other things. And that sounds like that's who you work with for the most part. Is that right?
Right. That's my background. It's really more, some people call them advocacy organizations.
Yeah.
Is really more my background.
Okay, so that's a 501c something else.
Usually C4s.
Okay.
And also political action committees, or I've worked with unions.
Right. And they all have other C designations besides C3. And so that's important. The point is, in this context, that people might look at these other opportunities in those other kinds of nonprofits besides just your traditional charity.
Yeah, I mean, I will say the one thing that is helpful if you're looking for if you're looking to transition into a career that's kind of issue-based,
Right.
it's really important that you're looking at the issues and perspective of your own values. It's the work is too engaging and too hard if you don't believe in it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting you say that. I've even found that out in C3 work, where if you can have a great opportunity, but if the cause isn't something that grabs you, that can be, like you say, much more difficult to work with, or at least you need to make that kind of mold it into your cause, maybe some aspect of it or a different view. If you're working in arts education and not really somebody who's into the arts, but you really are into education, maybe that's the perspective you take as opposed to the other. So let's start off with a fundamental question here. So what's bullying? What is bullying all about?
Well, I looked up a definition just to make sure that I was, giving something official.
Right.
And so I looked at the Society for Human Rights Management. And so their definition in a blog post is that they say that bullying is unwelcome behavior that occurs over a period of time and is meant to harm someone who feels powerless to respond. And I like that definition because when it comes down to it, things like bullying are about power.
Right.
It's about power and insecurity.
Yeah. Insecurity on whose part?
A part of the person doing the bullying.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right. I mean, I can give you examples. In retrospect, I can see where in situations that I was in that were bullying situations, it's very clear to me now with perspective and
Sure.
kind of distance that that person was wholly insecure.
Yeah.
They were trying to keep me away and kind of protect their own sense of self.
Wow.
It's very much about insecurity and powerlessness.
That's interesting, because now in reflection on that definition, I have seen that definitely, where people I know who are definitely bullies come to that, come with that insecurity, and it's the bluster that really tries to obfuscate the issue that they're dealing with, personally. So yeah, that's interesting. So how about, so there are other manifestations of that. There are manifestations of that, like when you're dealing with meetings or expectations or balance, right?
Right. So in my situation, just to give an example, when I experienced it, just one story as an example, I had run a campaign to rebuild a local organization or a state organization. And when we got to the stage where we really had to take it up to the next level, which was outside of my experience.
Right.
We had a new person who came in to kind of run the campaign. And I was grateful because it was in his experience and not yet in mine.
Sure.
And so when he came in, one of the things he did among many was he said, he was going to do a training for a bunch of our staff on kind of the next level of this thing. And I said, that's great. I'd love to learn that. And so I told him the dates that I was available for the training, and he deliberately went and scheduled it for times that I was not available.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so the things that I sort of learned to recognize are people scheduling things around you, in spite of you.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I kind of recognized is in a situation where it's kind of combination of bullying and burnout is, am I, excuse me,
It's all right.
am I uncomfortable? Am I reluctant? Am I insecure doing things that I know I'm good at? The things that I formerly really enjoyed about the job, am I reluctant to do them now?
Right.
And so I think
no, because you've been put in a position where you feel like you've kind of lost some of your confidence, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, you were going to say, and you think, yes?
Just an example, in another situation, one of the things that I do a lot is training.
Mm-hmm.
I design and facilitate all kinds of different training.
Sure.
And so in one situation, I was in the middle of kind of facilitating a training, and a couple of people walked in, and I was immediately nervous. Like, my boss walked in, and usually it's fine. I'm a good trainer. I know what I'm
Yeah.
doing. And I was all of a sudden tongue-tied, and all of my confidence went out the window.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so that, to me, in retrospect, not at the time, but in retrospect, is a sign to me that there's something wrong in that relationship,
Oh.
and that I should do something about that.
All right. That's fascinating. That's so you're, and I imagine being more aware of that, you can kind of monitor that in your own body with you can feel your blood pressure spike, or, have other physical manifestations of that, that might be external indicators that way.
Sure.
At least I would see that for me. I could feel that happening. So how does this impact like work-life balance? What's that? How's bullying, get to that aspect of your life?
Well, there isn't any balance. That
Okay.
is, I feel like it's a self-perpetuating cycle. A person who is bullied at work is constantly on edge. They're constantly trying to do better, do more, prove themselves, which leads to this unending cycle, where it just gets more stressful and less confident, more more difficult.
Right.
And so it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle that leads to a decline in the work.
Yeah.
And I know, again, in my own experience, when I got to the point where it was untenable, my work really suffered. I did not do as good a job.
Yeah. Yeah, I can, and I imagine also if there's expectations that are beyond what might be reasonable, that has an impact on it. I mean, my background, like is in charitable gift fundraising, and there's always pressure to do more. The bird, I always imagine myself as a bird feeding the fledglings in the nest, putting all the worms in their mouths. But that unreasonable expectations, I am sure, can be a form of this. Would that be right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways that that bullying shows up, and one of them is unreasonable expectations. That kind of goes hand in hand with kind of the traditional things you might think of as bullying, as belittling, or kind of speaking to people in demeaning ways, right? I'm not saying that everybody has to be a perfect angel all the time at work, although it'd be nice. But teasing, there's teasing that can reach the level of bullying if it impacts a person's mental health or their capacity to work.
Right.
It's I think that there are organizations that are better and worse at the expectations. I've been involved in some that were very unreasonable.
Yeah.
And I've been involved in others that were quite reasonable, where there was really a distribution of work that made sense. And people shared the burden fairly.
In a nonprofit, no less.
Yeah.
Well,
enough.
And I put it that way because there's always a high level of work burden. Well, I say always, but often a high level work burden in a nonprofit. But that distribution of that work burden, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think that if my perspective on how much work a person does is that when you have the luxury or the good fortune to do a job, to do that kind of work, to do work that you find meaning in a nonprofit way or in a kind of advocacy way, if you have that luxury, you do a lot of it.
Yeah.
That's the trade-off. And there are limits.
Right.
There
Right.
have to be limits.
Well, and that's again putting my fundraiser hat back on here for a second. It to me that's the equivalent of if somebody loves your organization, they will make an extra effort to give more to it beyond what you might expect. And it's the same. It sounds like if you love the mission, you're going to do more than you might expect. But this limit, like you say, is how much can they safely give while maintaining their life. And that would be kind of the equivalent of that work limit of how much can you safely do.
And to be honest, everybody's limit is different.
Mm,
I
yeah.
worked at an organization that I thought had great limits, especially in comparison to my previous experience. I left the office at 5 or 6 every day
Wow.
at this particular job, and I felt like it was very fulfilling and I did a great job. So a coworker came into my office once who had a different experience at other organizations, and he said he was pacing around the office and he said, do you feel like the work-life balance here is a little off? And I was like, no, this is the best work-life balance I've ever had.
Yeah.
And so it really, the line is different for everybody.
Mm,
And I think part of creating a terrific workplace as opposed to a toxic one is recognizing that.
yeah. Yeah.
And, if a person doesn't have the capacity to do work, that's one question.
Right.
And if you want to keep an effective team, everybody's limits have to be respected.
Yeah. Yeah. Now and it's funny, we all suffer from the sins of those who come before us. And I think when you were talking about that, I was thinking about one job I had where I got very nervous when the boss called me into his office, because in my previous job, that was always a bad thing.
Right.
And in this job, actually, it was typically a very good thing. And I just had to get used to that. I had to kind of readjust my my mental state about going into the boss's office, because it was a bad work environment before, and now it was much better. So,
Yeah, one of the things that I think about, that kind of kept me going in some of the tougher situations was relationships.
mm, yeah,
I always think that it's having been in some terrible work situations and in some great ones. I think if you have good coworkers, you can weather anything.
yeah, yeah,
And building those relationships with coworkers and those alliances is helpful, because in my experience, speaking up about something is always safer and more effective when people do it together.
yes, right,
I wouldn't ever suggest to someone that they stand on a table with a sign or even go in to talk to the boss by themselves.
mm,
It's
sure,
really, it really makes a difference in terms of effectiveness, but it also in terms of security when there's an alliance, when people do things together.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, the first thing that I like to do if I starting any new project or work is just build relationships with the people I'm working with.
mm. Makes a lot of sense. I
Yeah.
mean, because you will have to work with and through them for whatever you're doing. And so, yeah, being a Lone Ranger type is nice fiction, but not practical reality.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes having those ideas and kind of that leadership will help you build relationships with people.
Right.
It's just so much more effective when people do things together.
Yeah, no, exactly. So tell me now, what about, we've talked a little bit about the bullying aspect of a toxic workplace, but what about the burnout aspect? Well, what's burnout? I mean, is it just knocking your head against the wall all the time? Is it something different? How's that work?
Well, I looked up a definition for that too. So it has
Oh,
something
okay.
a little more official than my own opinion.
You're right.
And so this one, I like this one from the Mayo Clinic. I feel like they're a good
Yeah.
standard. So the Mayo Clinic defines it as a state of physical or emotional exhaustion that also involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and loss of personal identity.
Mm. Oh, that's interesting. Loss of personal identity.
And so I think that some of the ways that burnout shows up is, again, in the just not enjoying the things that a person is good at.
Right.
Dreading going to work every day.
Mm-hmm.
There were certain situations, I think burnout easily, I think the dangerous thing is that in many cases, and again, I'm not an expert, I'm not a therapist or a technician, but I think what's dangerous about burnout is that it sometimes slides into depression.
Yes, I have seen that.
Some of the signs or the manifestations are that nothing will work.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I had a situation where I was kind of at the end of my rope for many reasons. And so I was at the point where I was like calling a friend like just about every day and saying, oh, this is terrible and that's terrible. And it's, this person is doing these other things. And it was awful. And she came up with good ideas. Like she would come up with good suggestions and I would dismiss all of them.
Mm.
And she said to me at one point, dismissing any ideas or solutions is sometimes a sign of depression.
Yeah.
And so for me, and I'm not saying that burnout is depression, I'm just saying it's something to listen for.
Sure.
And then actually talk to a professional mental health person, not me.
Yeah, no, exactly. Right. Well, it's interesting because as you say this, I think back at, I hadn't thought of this for a long time. I had a person who worked in our office when I worked in Ohio who told me at some point that she had almost had an anxiety attack every Sunday night because she just didn't want to face coming in to do what we were doing there. And she eventually left. I mean, and she left and pursued a law degree, as it turns out. But she just it was getting, what we were doing was getting to her, and she couldn't quite explain it, except that she knew that she had this symptom that occurred every time she anticipated going to work.
I feel her pain, and I will say again, the thing that I would kind of bring back to the front of my mind, if I knew that I had to go and I knew that there were things I had to accomplish, was, okay, but the good news is I'll get to see Daniel. I'll get to see Carolyn.
Right.
I'll get to see Muhammad. Like the people that I knew who I worked well with and I had relationships with. And so when I could think through that, it was kind of a little step that made it somewhat more acceptable. Yeah. But I think that's a great sign. Like, I think if your friend got those signs and she left, that's the right thing to do. I did the same thing when I was finally at the end of my rope and I realized that this is not healthy.
Yeah.
I left. I mean, I had been at the organization for 10 and a half years. And
well, and in her case,
it was done.
She followed a dream, which really was important. She kind of went from a really bad situation for her. I don't know that I would describe our workplace as necessarily toxic, but we all have different personalities. This did not fit her personality, and it really built up in her. And she found something that she thought would, or at least gave her some future hope of doing something. Education can do that. where a lot of people I think see education as a stepping stone to something better. It's a very positive, future looking thing. And that's where her next step was, and lost touch with her after that, but I hope she did well with it. So how do you have handle these workplaces this way? I mean, there's you have bullying and burnout, and maybe the impact of what's going on around you, being in an advocacy organization, whether that's a C3 or a C something else. And so everybody is for the mission, right? And it almost seems like, well, you're having problems, you're disloyal to the mission, you're not doing your best for the cause, whatever. How do you handle that?
Well, I think that is a sign in itself. If there's
Mm,
somebody at your organization who's questioning your commitment
mm,
because you're not fulfilling unreasonable expectations, that should be a red flag, to be honest.
okay. Yeah.
And again, the thing that I recommend is relationships, and not doing this on your own. Are there other folks in your work group? Are there other folks in your team who are feeling the same pressure?
Okay.
And kind of strategize together about how to handle it. And it might be something internal. It might be something that the group of you can do to kind of support each other. And it might be that you come up with a strategy to go to whoever makes the decisions
Right.
and do something about it. The key is the relationships
Yeah.
and to
Now,
work together. The other thing that I discovered that is helpful is to know what I like to do outside of work.
oh, interesting.
I
Okay,
mean, the
good.
other sign that I was at the end of my rope, that I had reached the burnout stage, was I was the person who could only talk about work.
Yeah.
All of
Yeah.
my friends from work, all of my conversations revolved around work or something related to work. And at some point I realized I don't know how to talk about anything else.
Mm, yeah.
And so when I kind of stepped back to get some perspective and get, my own self back together, one of the things that I did was to figure out what I like to do when I'm not working and
Yeah.
make sure I do that. And that helps to relieve the burnout.
Somebody years ago told me that I guess he was European of some stripe or another, and said one of the typical things about an American is they define themselves by their work, and it's just kind of how our culture has evolved. And where he claimed that and he doesn't know what a good number of his friends do because they never talked about work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And I think if that's your sole focus, then it's a red flag.
yeah, well, it's also, but it's a cultural reinforcement, and that it isn't necessarily healthy, that we need to look at.
The other thing I think is a sign that, a person might be on the wrong course is their relationships with their family.
Mm,
I had a
interesting.
coworker once in a very intense organization where, we were working every weekend. There were high level meetings, elected leaders of the organization every weekend, all the time. And so at one point she said, I haven't seen my husband or my stepson in weeks, and
Wow.
they're the reason I can still do this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was sort of a flashpoint for me. It's like, in her life, that's who keeps her grounded. And if
Yep.
she is so intense and so busy that she can't see them, she can't do the work.
That's, I worked for a youth services organization years and years ago. And one of the things after I left that kind of struck me was that anybody who had been there for any length of time was divorced.
Yep.
And the purpose of the organization was to help families and help them come together around positive activities. But all the people who are running it put so much time into it, it affected their relationships.
Absolutely. I mean, the organization that I was at for 10 and a half years and finally left, when I left and I went to a more stable kind of normal place,
Yeah.
I was reflecting on that exact same question. And just about everyone I knew from the first organization was on their second or third relationship.
Yeah.
Marriage or partnership.
Sure.
And whereas everyone at the new organization was either, if they were single, I don't think anybody was single except me. And everyone, it was their first relationship, like
Sure.
their first marriage, their first, partnership, long-term partnership.
Yeah.
And they hadn't moved through several partners.
Yeah. It's interesting to look back and to see those and kind of wake up and say, wow, what's around me here? And is this my future as you're in that organization? So how should, you said go in and as a team and build relationships, right? But are there other strategies to handle bullying or an off balance or workplace?
Just again, in my experience,
Yeah.
the best solutions for me were to kind of rely on the support and relationships that I had inside and outside the workplace. I had one of the things that those support relationships helped me do was figure out when to leave.
Okay. Yeah.
I had people that I had a friend who does similar work. He does more political work than I do, but he came over and we were chatting one day and I just started crying.
Mm.
And he said he was scared because he'd never seen that before.
Yeah.
And he was like, I don't know what to do. I mean, he was a friend. We were not romantic friends.
Yeah. Right.
He was like, I don't know what to do. I've never seen you cry. I don't know what to do about this.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, that kind of helped me, put me on, another step to figuring out when to leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes that's what you have to do. And that's tough. If folks need the job, it's really tough. And sometimes it's a really difficult decision.
Well, and you make me remember or think about, that a lot of times when you see a lot of turnover in an organization, you have to step back and look, especially if you're going into that organization, and what is the cause of that? Is this a work environment that is helpful or not? Are they, what's causing that churn? And my son has a client that he has worked with on and off for a number of years, and it's a nonprofit. And he says that just about every year he works with a new team of people.
Yeah.
And and I can see from the leadership I know of the organization why that's possible, why that happens.
I was just going to say that that's a sign.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that it's a more difficult time to read these days since career trajectories are different than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. People
Sure.
tend to cycle through roles more on like a 3-year cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a more difficult sign to read. And it's also an important sign to read.
Yeah. Yeah.
A friend of mine asked that direct question when he was being recruited for a job that I did.
Yeah.
He asked because there had been quite a bit of turnover since I left.
Sure.
So he asked the hiring manager about that. He was very direct. And her answer, I think, was good. She said, I am working on that. I like to think I'm a good manager, and I think I have room to grow.
Mm.
And so I think that is the opposite sign too. Like if there's a way to speak up about something, about a workplace environment, the reaction of the person you're talking to is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. If they are in total denial, that's a sign, right?
And it's what's difficult about this is that bullying can be illegal harassment,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not always. There are some things that some environments at workplaces that are just lousy.
Yeah.
But not against the law.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some organizations might have stronger policies than the law, in fact,
Mm-hmm.
and some might not.
Yeah.
So it sometimes comes down to a question of what a person can do for herself that is not reliant on the structure of the workplace. And sometimes, honestly, that's therapy,
Yeah.
right? Not to sound too woo-woo about it, but it helps. I mean, it helped me when I left. It helped me to understand that the bullying and the treatment that I faced there was less about me and more about the people there.
Yeah. And one of the tragedies I see from a nonprofit perspective is that they lose some of the best people with this. I mean, the good people are going to go someplace and try to find a better environment because they're good people. They bring skills, and that it's a real loss to the mission they serve, which is tragic.
Yes and no, because I think that there are people who really do put themselves at risk for the mission.
Oh, well, fair enough. Yeah, that's true.
And they stick it out longer than you would expect.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a very good point. So one of the things that obviously in a nonprofit environment we deal with is volunteers.
Yeah.
And volunteers aren't, I would guess, not immune to this, right? I mean, this is whether they interact with staff, each other, or, is the volunteer the bully to the staff? Is the staff a bully to the volunteer? Volunteer to volunteer problems, and then also burnout broadly in this. I mean, what have you seen that way?
Well, that's interesting. I love that you asked the volunteer question, because it's a lot of what I do is volunteer management, what I've done in the past. My philosophy about volunteering is a couple of things. One, volunteers should learn something new every time.
Right.
Not necessarily every shift, but they should constantly learn new things. And the relationships are important. It's really important to build relationships one-on-one with volunteers and among volunteers. I mean, that's the reason that a lot of organizations will have a volunteer party, not just a thank you party, but an opportunity for volunteers to get to know each other, because that keeps them engaged. It keeps them interested. Yeah. And so those relationships are super important. I also think the thing that helps volunteers feel valued and relieve their burnout is to actually listen to them. Volunteers who have been on both sides, volunteers who have been around for a long time and folks who bring a new perspective sometimes have a good idea. Yeah. And I know that for me, in some of my interaction with volunteers is on political campaigns. Sure. Where volunteers will be knocking on doors and making phone calls and going to events and stuff like that. And often their perspective on voters' reactions will inform new iterations of the script, for example. Yeah. For example, or new versions of messaging. So their input and perspective on voters' reactions is super important. Well, I can also see where you have to look at the people who are coming to the party, you might say, who are your volunteers, because a lot of them are very skilled professionals in what they do. I had an instance where a friend told me she volunteered for a local science-based museum, and she, in her professional life, had been a communications director. And she was totally dismissed by one of the people there because, well, you're just a volunteer. And she's like, wow, because I'm just a volunteer with a lot of skill I can help you out with here. And she wasn't even talking, she was talking to one of the scientists or something, right? And I mean, it wasn't like a peer-to-peer kind of communications director person, but that they bring things that they may not like. They may volunteer because they don't want to do their job someplace else, right? But they also bring a perspective from whatever they do that it's really frustrating for them when it's just dismissed out of hand. Sure. That's a tough, I will say, just to, diverge a little bit. That's a really tough situation for a volunteer manager. There are a lot of volunteers who come in and say, I'm a writer. Yeah. I'm a event planner. I'm a something else. So it's tough for them before they get to know the person. It's tough for them to figure out who's really going to be an asset in that role and who's not. I can't tell you how many campaigns I worked on where a volunteer came rushing to the office and said, I'm a volunteer. I could help you out and I could write all your news releases. Yeah. I don't want the person anywhere near our message. Okay. And listening to them could have good ideas. There's a lot of things that volunteers can do that are not like the top thing, in that situation. we always need letters to the editor.
Yeah.
It's just a question of being creative to build relationships with volunteers and keep them engaged. And in the situation that I think you mentioned,
Yeah.
where relationships between volunteers are not good, it's tough. I think that if there's a volunteer who's holding back the work, that's a tough situation. And that volunteer needs either to be asked not to come back or to have a little heart to heart with them.
Yeah.
The volunteer manager has to have the heart to heart with them.
Well, and then, but then coming back to the bullying and burnout, right? That where do you come to a position where you see a volunteer being bullied because maybe they're not performing up to specs, or they've just been doing it so long, they're standing in front of a door and saying, "Hello, I am here for," and not really putting their heart to it.
Yeah. Well, again, I think that's the place where the relationship comes in, and the concern and showing the interest in their well-being, I bet would go a long way.
Yeah. Now, how about staff bullying volunteers in terms of, or excuse me, flip that around. How about volunteers bullying staff, like a board member coming in and saying, "Hey, this is my great idea. Third or fourth tier down staff person, you need to do it," and almost, implying that something else may not occur if they don't.
That's, again, one of those tough situations. That person, that second or third tier person, shouldn't have to do that. And frankly, it's their supervisor's responsibility to protect them.
Right.
In any healthy organization. And again, it's tough. And the better, I sound like a broken record, but the better relationships all around, because it might be that second or third tier employee supervisor is also being bullied by the board. And so the closer alliances they have, the better, right? And I'm not saying anybody should go and attack a board member, but there has to be a way to have a conversation.
Well, and my experience with that is sometimes it comes down to a top leadership issue where they're reluctant to have that conversation because that board member has some leverage somewhere, and that becomes a problem.
Yeah. No, I think that happens in all kinds of organizations. And again, the relationships in the workplace matter. And at some point, sometimes it's just so untenable, you can't do it. Yeah.
Well, so kind of changing gears here. So how do you pick the kind of organization that you want to work for, and recognize that, hey, this could be a good place for me because it's not suffering from these issues, while not, of course, penduluming, right? Because that happens a lot of times where you get into a bad situation or some kind, and then we say, "Oh, well, we want this other side," and that becomes a problem too. To find a place that's balanced for you. How does that work?
I think the key question is, where are your values? Where's your passion? Because again, sometimes it's tough work and intense work. And the more a person believes in that work, the more grounded they're going to be doing it.
Okay.
So when I graduated from college a long time ago, I decided, I made a conscious decision that I wanted to start out working. I wanted to work in women's rights. I wanted to do feminist work. And so that's what I looked for. And I ended up working at a feminist organization, and it was tough. Like, it was very intense. And because it spoke to my values.
Right.
And so I was able to do it because it spoke to my values. So I think that's the first thing people have to do. If you're pouring your heart into something, it needs to be something that deserves your heart.
Yeah. So just like you should be, while you're on the job, an advocate for the mission. Yeah. You need to start with that when you're looking for that right position.
Yeah, I think that it also depends on the kind of role you're looking for. There are some roles where the that have less impact on how do I put this?
They're
That
not
are
connected quite to the mission
yeah, that
directly.
don't get to define the mission. They
Right.
definitely have an impact on the mission.
Oh yeah, right.
I mean, every accountant and every HR person and every receptionist has an impact on the mission.
Sure.
And they also, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, don't always get to make any decisions on that mission.
Yes.
So just because of their role.
Right.
So it may be more or less intense. And it always helps if your heart is in it.
Yeah. 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 They have to be still advocates for that mission. And I find that they're better off if they're able to somehow connect the fact that their accounting work allows whatever that mission is to occur and impacts that person who is the beneficiary of that mission.
Oh, absolutely. It all works together.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though they're not out there, doing direct service work. So we talked about, burnout and bullying and kind of workplace toxicity, right? So tell me, where does racism and sexism and all that come into play here? What's the what do you see as part of that bigger picture?
This is the thing that I love to talk about the most. Because in our culture, that injustice is so deeply embedded that we don't even recognize that the bullying or the unfair workplace comes from racism or comes from sexism. So they're so closely intertwined that practices or customs that we think that kind of the dominant culture thinks are normal or accepted or required are actually legacy or vestiges of white supremacy or male supremacy. So I think that the intersection of that kind of injustice and bullying is direct.
Okay, interesting.
And so folks who are surviving that kind of bullying and potential allies have to proactively recognize or look for instances of where what's prompting a behavior or a situation is actually racism or sexism or homophobia or whatever the injustices are.
Right.
And because of the way our legal system is structured, a person can face that kind of bullying, that racism or the homophobia or whatever, and still not prevail in court.
Right.
Because it's harder than you'd think to bring those cases.
Yeah.
And just re-traumatizes the person.
But even before you get to a legal situation, right, being able to recognize that and I don't know, think of the phrase defang it before you get to that point is really helpful if you have this perspective that, hey, there might be more here than just the micro interactions between people. It might be the macro cultural situation that we're in.
Right. I think that one of the things I like to think about is, we talk a lot about, does the person fit into the culture? Are they a good fit?
Right.
Is it her own fault because she doesn't fit into the culture or he's not a team player? And so often team player and culture and fit are code for white and male.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's really important to think about when we're saying someone's not a good fit or they're uncomfortable or they're feeling bullied, but that's because she's oversensitive or he makes everything about race.
Right.
Actually, a lot of things are about race. And the things that white people don't necessarily see is because we wouldn't. And we
Yeah.
have to take that seriously.
Right.
If
Right.
a person is feeling pressured because of their race or their sexual orientation or their, their home country or whatever, there might be something there.
Oh, yeah.
And if we dismiss it by saying, oh, stop being so sensitive, or do you see race in everything? That's a form of gaslighting.
Yeah. Now
It's
it reminds me of I want to say Henry Kissinger said this, but it may have been somebody else that basically if somebody is paranoid, they're probably right.
yeah, I don't dismiss that. I used to think, I used to be in the, oh, they're oversensitive camp. But
Yeah.
I don't do that because how would I know?
Right.
How would I
Yeah.
know if an immigrant is being oversensitive? I've been here for 4 generations.
Yeah.
How would I know? And if you can't tell people how to feel,
Right. And you can't live
right?
in their shoes either.
Mm-hmm.
As far
And
hard as to
so
try.
it's worth listening to. And to be a good ally, it's worth listening to and listening for.
Yeah.
If we want to be an ally in eliminating the white supremacy, eliminating the injustice in our workplace, it's more than just a question of feeling sorry for that person, but it's looking for the patterns, it's listening, it's offering support, and recognizing that bullying is racism. Bullying is sexism. And, men can be bullied and white people can be bullied. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's racist. And people of color, women, anybody who's not part of a dominant culture face it in ways that some of us can't even imagine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have to take that seriously or we're never going to wipe out the injustice in our workplaces.
Well, and these things will be perpetuated on an ongoing basis. So turning a bit to so what makes, just kind of wrapping things up here, what makes a good workplace? What should people be looking for when they look for their next job and say, yeah, not only do I love the mission and I feel like I can contribute meaningfully, but this looks like a great place to work, even though they don't have the plaque on the wall from the local chamber of commerce that says voted best place to work.
Yeah. Well, I think there are formal and informal signs. Okay. Formal signs are, do they have the policies in place? How strong are their policies around diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Okay.
If there aren't policies that are strong and recognize that there is racism, there is sexism, there is exclusion, and actively work to eliminate them, I would think twice.
So there's a formal aspect of this that needs to be considered. And then how about the informal kind of things you just kind of keep your eye open for?
Their relationships. I like to talk to people who work there and see what they think. And no one's ever going to tell you this is a crappy place to work, don't come.
Oh, I don't know about that. Actually, I've had that happen once.
It's unlikely.
Yes.
And there are also cues, you can, if you're really listening to what the person is saying, there are cues. So I would think about the relationships. I would think about the, like you had said earlier, the turnover.
Yeah.
What's the turnover like? And the reputation, if there's some organizations that have a reputation. Yeah. Sometimes it's earned.
Yeah. Well, somebody, I'll never forget a fella who used to work for an organization that had a bit of a turnover that I'd seen. He described it as a Vietnam-like experience.
Yes, that would not be on the top of my list to work at.
Yeah, correct. Right. Yeah. But it was good that he was honest about that, and refreshing too. He wasn't, but of course this was after he had left. And one of the things I find, it kind of reminds me of exit interviews. How people aren't necessarily honest in those because they might, I got a better paying job someplace, right? And they're going to go with that as opposed to, this is a really lousy place to work.
Yeah,
because it's just easier.
Well, and again, it just depends on the alliances you have.
Yeah.
Someone doesn't have any alliances, if they don't have their relationship, they're not going to feel comfortable being honest because no one
Right.
has.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much. So, anything else that you think needs to come out on this topic that we may not have covered?
Probably. I would say that, again, in my experience, the solution for me was to leave.
Hmm.
And the solutions were to leave the organization and figure out what I'd like to do outside of work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I leaned on the relationships and the support that I had. Because it was how do I become a whole person? How do I, when I go into the next very intense situation, how do I keep myself?
Right.
I also had a good therapist.
Hmm.
And health insurance now is required to cover some portion of mental health.
Sure. Sure. And with telehealth, that even makes it more accessible. Yeah.
And just the relationships and the support of your family and your friends are super helpful and can help you get perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great, and that makes a big difference. And I think it's important that folks know this, but I feel compelled to say it again. Getting help outside is no shame. In fact, it's something that a lot of folks would benefit from, and actively doing this is important for them, whether it's a work issue or not. So that's a big part of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this is great. So tell me, if people want to get a hold of you, not for therapy
Yes.
or legal or HR advice,
That's not my expertise.
right? But for what you do on a daily basis to help organize and get the causes they love, the attention they deserve, what do they do?
Well, there's a bunch of ways to contact me. You can follow me on social media. I'm at
Mhm.
Organizing to Win, all
That's
one word.
organizing, right? ING, right?
Organizing to Win,
Yep.
all one word. That's also my website, organizingtowin.net.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a contact form there, or just email Mira at organizingtowin.net. Good to meet all of you.
I hope you enjoyed today's presentation and got a lot out of it. Mira had a lot of great things to say about bullying in the workplace, burnout, and so much more. So, thanks so much. This is Matt Hug for the Nonprofit Career Network and Great Careers, wishing you a great nonprofit day.